Big move today by the coalition to show up the government's lack of action on anti-Semitism terrorism. Drawing a line in the sand, Peter Dutton announced today that if elected, he would bring in mandatory minimum sentences for anti-Semitic terror attacks. Joining me now, the Shadow Attorney-General, Senator Michaelia Cash. Well, viewers will have seen a breakdown of what the coalition is proposing, Senator, but in practical terms, how will these laws be applied with regards to the sort of terror attacks we've seen so recently?
Well, Peter, in the first instance, what we are saying is if you commit an act of terrorism in Australia, if you are found to be preparing to commit an act of terrorism in Australia, you should at the very least face a mandatory minimum penalty. I think many would be surprised to know that there is no mandatory minimum penalty. So Peter Dutton has said we will take the toughest approach possible and introduce a 6-year mandatory minimum penalty. The example being, of course, the firebombing of the Adass synagogue. This is an act of terrorism. The people found responsible for it under our laws would be subjected to a minimum of 6 years behind bars. But more than that, for example, if you were caught on your way with the accelerant or the ignition device to commit the act of terrorism, the firebombing of a synagogue, again, you would face a minimum of 6 years behind bars. And as I said, I think viewers would be surprised to know currently there's no mandatory minimum. All we're saying is you commit an act of terrorism, you plan an act, it's 6 years behind bars at least.
Senator, we know Labor sent your counterpart, Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus, off to Israel to try and mend the bridges, but it doesn't look like it's going well. The Israeli Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, so very senior politician, Sharon Heskel, she's linked Labor's ongoing campaign against Israel to the rise of anti-Semitism here that we know is in the headlines around the world. Now, the PM was asked about this today. This is what he had to say.
Well, Australia voted in the United Nations, along with 158 countries. We voted for a ceasefire that is now in place. We wanted to see hostages released, and I welcome the fact that today the hostages have begun to be released.
Haskell was scathing Michaelia, and the PM tried hard to sort of dance around that issue today. Well, what was your read of her comments?
I don't know. I don't think even I know anymore where this man stands on anti-Semitism, other than his government is responsible for the rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. And I think the Deputy Israeli Foreign Minister called it as it is. That was an indictment on Mr Albanese. It was an embarrassment for Australia. But more than that, doesn't matter what Mr Albanese says. He needs to be judged on his actions. And his actions, or should I say lack of action, clearly show his government. They are responsible for the rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. Their stance in the United Nations has undermined our relationship with our great friend Israel. But you're going to love this, Peter. They send the Attorney-General of Australia, the man who has refused to rule out arresting Prime Minister Netanyahu if he was to come to Australia because of the International Criminal Court warrants that are against him. I mean, it is totally laughable that Mr Dreyfus thinks that he can in any way mend a relationship that he's partly responsible for.
One of the things that really struck me last week with the ceasefire deal being negotiated and the release of imprisoned Palestinian terrorists as part of this deal, they are required under the deal to be repatriated or to leave to move to a third country. A lot of concern by your colleague Julie and Lisa that they could end up in Australia given the track record of this government. He's demanded that the Prime Minister rule out that any of these convicted Palestinian terrorists come to Australia in any way, shape or form. What's the latest here?
Well, you won't be surprised to know that there is no update from the Prime Minister. I would have thought it would have been a pretty clear, we rule out any terrorist or Palestinian terrorist ever coming to this country. Because I can tell you, under Peter Dutton, there won't even be a look-in. There will be no consideration. Our policy is very, very clear. You are not in any way ever coming anywhere near Australia. And quite frankly, shame on our Prime Minister for being unable to just articulate what I would have thought Australians would say is a pretty basic answer. And that should speak volumes. God forbid Australia has a government that is Anthony Albanese in minority with the Australian Greens.